Boa tarde, gente. Boa tarde. So good to have you all. Welcome. As director of the Center for Latin American Studies, it gives me both great pleasure and also a little bit of sadness to say that this is our last talk of the quarter. It's been an amazing quarter, and we are closing with a beautiful ribbon, as it were, broche de oro, we say in Spanish. We're having Professor Octavio Ferraz, who will be giving a talk entitled "Can Science and Law Save the Amazon and Its Peoples?" For those of you joining us on the live stream, kindly submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section, and we will be closed captioning the live stream video in the coming weeks. Before I introduce the person who will introduce the speaker, right, the way we do things here, I'd like to thank Professor Leif Winner from the Philosophy Department and Ethics at Stanford for co-organizing, co-conspirating, and making this event possible. We look forward to future collaborations, and it is terrific that we get our MA students to participate in an interdisciplinary setting and to learn from a different approach to the objects of study that we've been working on throughout the year. So it truly is an honor. And now let me pass the mic over to Nina Dimeira Borba, who is a PhD student in the History Department in the second year, I believe. Nina, please.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Nina, and today I have the enormous pleasure of introducing Dr. Octavio Ferraz, although his scholarship and phenomenal work truly speak for themselves. Dr. Octavio Ferraz is a professor of law and co-director of the Transnational Law Institute at King's College London. He holds an LLB and MPhil in law from the University of Sao Paulo, an MA in medical ethics and law from King's College London, where he was awarded the Benjamin Geijsen Prize, and a PhD in law from University College London. Professor Ferraz's professional journey includes significant roles in academia and legal practice, such as his work as a senior research officer to the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Health. Before joining King's College, Ferraz held the role of Professor Poe-Hunt at the University of Essex and was a professor at Warwick Law School. In addition to his academic pursuits, he has over 10 years of experience practicing law in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and continues to contribute to the legal field in Brazil. With an extensive array of written works, including his book, Health as a Human Right, The Politics and Judicialization of Health in Brazil, published by Cambridge University Press, and numerous journal publications in both English and Portuguese, Professor Ferraz has been doing an outstanding and continuous work focused on human rights and development, particularly the role and impact of law and courts on poverty, equality, and social justice. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Octavio Ferraz for his talk, Can Science and Law Save the Amazon and Its Peoples?
Thank you very much, Nina, for this generous introduction. Thanks, Hector, for inviting me to be here today. Thanks, Leif, for making this possible. Sarah and Elizabeth for the organization, and everyone else who is here today in this beautiful Friday afternoon in Stanford to hear a bit more about the Amazon. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So the title of my lecture may evoke immediately two further questions. Why and from what or from whom does the Amazon need to be saved? I will go back to this soon enough, but before that I would like to give you a brief description of what we are talking about. The Amazon is probably too abstract an idea in the minds of most people. That mysterious forest somewhere in South America with exotic animals, huge trees, and massive rivers. That was my idea of the Amazon too, before I started studying it. And before I visited it for the first time, which happened only in the fourth decade of my life. Most Brazilian people like me, born and raised in the south and southeast of Brazil, never visit the Amazon. Most of us visit Paris, London, Miami, New York, before even thinking of visiting the Amazon, if we ever do. And this is unfortunate, because the Amazon is not only beautiful, as I learned after I started visiting it, but probably the most important thing that happens to be located in Brazil, especially at the current juncture of the climate and environmental global crisis. So, the Amazon. Let's start by saying a few things about the Amazon. It's the largest tropical rainforest in the world. It's larger than the next two largest rainforests combined, which are the ones in the Congo Basin in Africa and Borneo in Indonesia and Malaysia. It covers some 40% of the South American continent. Its total area is around 80 million square kilometers or 3 million square miles. 80% of that area, or 5.5 million square kilometers, 2.1 million square miles, was originally covered by forest. Now, it's hard to grasp what that means, the level of magnitude of this number. So let me use some comparisons. It's about 10 times the size of France, more than 20 times the size of the UK, almost twice the size of India, similar to the size of Australia. And since we are in the US, the Amazon is not far from the size of the 48 contiguous states in the United States. So this image juxtaposing both shows nicely how they compare. So it's huge. The Amazon is not only majestic due to its trees, but also to its rivers. The main one, the Amazon River, starts in the Peruvian Andes, 5,200 meters high, and flows through 6.4 thousand kilometers all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in the northeast of Brazil, in Pará, there, as you can see in the map. So it's by far the world's largest river by volume, more than 5 times the volume of the Congo River, or 12 times that of the Mississippi River here in the US. It has over 1,100 tributaries, 17 of which are longer than 1,000 miles. You can see like many of the main ones here. So as you might also see in that picture, the Amazon spans 9 countries, so as well as Brazil, which is home to 60% of the Amazon. The Amazon is also to be found in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Guyana, Suriname, and the French Guiana. Now, it is of course not only because of its size that the Amazon is important. Size does matter, of course, as we will see later on, due to the scale of the benefits that the Amazon provides to South America and beyond. But the Amazon is also important because of the incredible biodiversity it contains. From what we know, and there is a lot we don't know yet, because large chunks of the Amazon are not explored, the Amazon is home to 16,000 tree species, 390 billion individual trees, 40,000 plant species, 2.5 million species of insects, 1.3 thousand types of birds, 427 types of mammals, 3,000 fish species, 1,000 types of amphibians, and 400 types of reptiles. So this great biodiversity is not only valuable in itself, a wonder to be appreciated, gifted to us by nature, but it's also significantly useful to humans if managed properly, that is, sustainably. The fish, the mammals, the fruits are of course sources of food, but the plants are also great sources of medicines, and the forest as a whole, as we'll discuss more about later, is crucial to climate regulation in the region and beyond. Now, last but not least, it's important to recall that the Amazon is also the home of many humans. So there are more than 30 million people living in the Amazon, mostly settlers that moved there in the past 5 to 6 decades. But there are also people who have been there for much longer, for centuries or even millennia. According to the most recent statistics, there are currently 2.2 million indigenous individuals in the Amazon from more than 300 different ethnic groups. And there are also riverine communities who settled in the area sometime during the colonial period, many belonging to the so-called Quilombola communities, which are descendants of former enslaved Africans who fled from plantations and formed communities deep into the forest. So this is the Amazon in a nutshell. A massive expanse of land, trees and water, which is a haven of biodiversity and home to some 30 million people. Its importance comes not only from its intrinsic value as a natural wonder, but also from the so-called ecosystemic services that the forest provides not only to those living there, but well beyond. As well as being a source of food and medicine, as already mentioned, the Amazon is also an important source of water to nearby regions, as the moist produced by the evapotranspiration, a full-mouth word, of the trees create the so-called flying rivers that affect rain patterns across the continent. Last but not least, the Amazon is an important asset for fighting global heating, or global warming as some prefer to say. As trees draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, they lock away CO2 in their leaves, trunks, roots, and nearby soil. The Amazon's sheer volume of trees, the size we were talking about earlier, makes it one of the world's largest carbon sinks. According to leading climate scientist Carlos Nobre from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and I quote, "The Amazon today stores more than 150 billion metric tons of carbon, the equivalent of more than 10 years worth of global fossil fuel emissions." I'll repeat, 10 years of global fossil fuel emissions is stored in the Amazon. So about 20% of all the carbon captured by the vegetation across the planet is captured by the trees in the Amazon, 20%. The forest also provides an important surface cooling effect, keeping the regional temperature lower by several degrees compared to deforested agricultural land nearby. Whoever has ever traveled through the Amazon, you can feel it in the temperature marker of your car. If you are going through the forest and then you enter a deforested bit, the temperature rises by around 5 degrees. Now, for some scientists, this effect is global, not just regional. Although there is debate about that, and I don't know if there are any climate scientists here who can discuss that later. We will have some on Tuesday in the panel. But for some, like Elena Shevlyakova, a physical scientist of the US National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, I quote, "Releasing 120 billion metric tons of CO2, which is a more conservative estimate of the Amazon carbon storage, by removing forests would warm the planet by an estimated 0.25 degrees Celsius." That might sound little, but 0.25, when you need to keep below 1.5 is quite a lot. So as she emphasizes, quote again, "Even if the emerald biome seems like a distant world, everyone on Earth is connected to its fate." So there are plenty of intrinsic and instrumental reasons for us to want to save the Amazon. So let me turn now to the second part of my talk about what or whom the Amazon needs to be saved from. So the last 5 decades or so have not been good for the Amazon, particularly not in Brazil, which is where my research focuses on. So in the period of my lifespan, so a little more than 5 decades, the Brazilian Amazon has lost about between 1/5 and 1/4 of its trees, so 20 to 25% depending on different studies. The main culprit of this devastation, as you may have guessed, has been predatory economic exploitation. That is, non-sustainable economic exploitation of the forest's natural resources, mostly wood and minerals, and then after deforestation to get the wood and minerals, agricultural projects, mostly cattle farming, soy, and corn production. At first, deforestation was an official government policy. From the 30s to the 40s, when the Amazon was virtually untouched, a view emerged and gained strength that Brazil had to occupy the empty, inverted commas, Amazon for national security reasons. especially to secure its vast borders. Alongside the national security reason, there was also the idea that the Amazon was an untapped resource and an unlimited supply of land to landless farmers from the south and northeast of Brazil. A land without people for a people without land, said the slogan of the military government's program of the 60s and the 70s. Of course, there were lots of people in the Amazon, but the military didn't see that. The policy of the military government combined the distribution of land for free for farmers without land, the construction of several motorways through the forest, most notably the infamous Transamazônica, BR 230, that cut the heart of the forest from east to west, the construction of hydroelectric power dams, and the concession of loans and tax incentives for companies who open businesses in the forest. This development model, and development in inverted commas in my view, was very successful. If your measure of success is to increase the human-wide population, erase everything else. Trees, plants, animals, and the indigenous peoples who had been living there for centuries. Hordes of individuals, mostly from the south and northeast of Brazil, moved to the Amazon, razed the forest to the ground, as the government asked them to do, and turned it into farms. The official and unapologetic destruction policy lasted till the end of the military period in the mid-80s, but its effects and the mindset it created are still with us today. The forest is still seen by many, including powerful local businesses and political groups that support mayors, state governors, and even presidents of the country. They see it as a nothingness. The Amazon is a nothingness that needs to be replaced by something, and something productive. And this is inevitably cattle, grains, and minerals, so non-sustainable economic exploitation. In his research for his interesting book, Arrabalde, which means the periphery in Portuguese, expressing that idea that for most Brazilians, the Amazon is the periphery where you don't want to go. Pedro Moreira Salles, the author, heard time and again from the farmers he interviewed, quote, "When I arrived, there was nothing here. I built this all by myself," said the farmers, pointing their fingers to the vast amounts of pasture or plantations with no single tree in view. So despite the end of the military dictatorial regime in the mid-80s and the growth of the environmental movement, which secured the enactment of several important protective laws, which I'll talk about later in the third part of my talk, destruction of the forest has continued and been driven by the same old developmental model through the 90s and in this new century. As the graph shows, deforestation has remained high throughout the current democratic period, which started in 1985. And since 1988, which is also when data started to be more systematically connected, we can see that deforestation was above 10,000 square kilometers per year in most of the period. And in some years, it was above 20,000 square kilometers, reaching a peak of almost 30,000 square kilometers in 1995. Now, again, what does that mean in terms of size? To use some comparative paradigms again, we are talking of an area between 100 and 300 times the city of Paris every year. So 100 times, 300 times the size of Paris, which is 100 square kilometers, more or less, being deforested every year. Or 150 to 450 times the size of Palo Alto, where I'm staying with Leif in his beautiful home. Or between 3 and 9 times the Yosemite National Park. Yosemite National Park being destroyed every year. At the peak in 1995, a whole Paris was being deforested every 30 hours in the Amazon. During the Bolsonaro 4 years in government, and the data doesn't capture this whole government, which went from 2018 to 2022, the deforestation went up again. So and we reached like higher levels after that, in great part incentivized by his rhetoric of development, which was very similar, if not identical, to the one during the military dictatorship, which he openly supports and venerates. So one thing no one can accuse Bolsonaro of is of deceiving people. He says everything that he thinks. In the current government, deforestation went down, so the current Lula government, but still remains at, let's use the comparative straight away, 50 Paris per year, right? So we are celebrating today that deforestation in the Amazon went down to 50 sizes, times the size of the city of Paris every year. At a time of climate environmental crisis, when we should be recovering the forest, this is clearly too much and must therefore be stopped. In the third part of my talk, I will move on to what can and should be done to stop deforestation. But before that, let us look briefly at the main drivers of deforestation to have a clearer idea. So the four main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon today are beef, soy, and other grains, mostly corn, wood, and mining, in that order in terms of magnitude of deforestation. So the biggest culprit today is beef. The usual process of turning forest into farms is well known. So let me show first, like this is soya, this is Cargill's plants in the Amazon, wood, mining. This is a picture I took myself with a drone in the Munduruku indigenous community land in Pará. So these are the four main drivers. And as I said, the usual process of turning forest into farm is well known. First, quality wood is ripped off the land and sold in the wood market. Then the remaining forest is cleared, usually through tractors and chains and or fire, which contributes to climate change. Once all trees and forest animals are gone, then comes the cattle or the soy or both. So this transformation of land use, to put it technically, or forest devastation, to put it bluntly, used to take place mostly alongside the main motorways and roads built by the military, but now has started to penetrate into the depths of the forest through the construction of informal byroads by the exploiters themselves. And this is what is worrying, because once the middle of the forest becomes degraded, then the resilience of the forest goes significantly down as well. So the so-called turning points that we'll probably hear a lot about on Tuesday come closer and closer once we start to gut the forest from the inside. And there is also the problem of fires that have become more and more common in the Amazon, which are both caused and contribute to climate change. So the land is much drier than it used to be. Rainfall is lesser. This is a picture of this past November, when the levels of the water went so much down that you could walk across what was formerly river, and the waters took much longer to come back to their normal levels, and in some places it's not even back there yet. The mortality of fish, including dolphins, river dolphins from the Amazon, was huge this year because of the temperature of the water and the lack of water. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is how the Amazon influences the rain patterns across the continent, because a significant part of the water for Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and some claim even down to Argentina, comes from this evapotranspiration of trees in the Amazon that is then blown to these other countries. Okay, so what to do? And I move on now to the third part of my presentation, third and final part. We have seen how great and important the Amazon is and how it is gradually being destroyed by short-term predatory economic interests. So in this final part, I want to turn to what can and should be done about this. And the first thing to note is that we know what to do and have the means, technical and legal, to implement it. Significant knowledge about the Amazon has developed significantly, and this can be very useful to guide the public policy aimed at protecting it. We know much better today what we are losing by allowing the forest to be replaced by pastures and plantation. Past Brazilian governments may be to some extent excused for seeing the forest as a green nothingness, or a green hell, as some called it, to be occupied, controlled, and turned into something productive in the narrow sense of the term. This was a view held by almost everyone in the 60s and the 70s, with the exception of very few environmental visionaries, such as José Lutzenberger, for instance. But we know much better now. Thanks to a growing number of studies, we know that the trade-off we make when we allow the forest to be replaced by farms is a very bad one, for several reasons. We know now that the forest, rather than a green nothingness, is in fact a wonderfully complex living system, a huge repository of biodiversity that is valuable in itself, as I argued already, but also instrumentally valuable due to the various benefits it can provide to us humans, including rain and climate regulation, food, and medicines. So we need to factor those benefits into any analysis of alternative uses of the land in the Amazon. Is it a wise choice to turn the forest into beef? Is it clever to turn it into soy, mostly to feed chicken and pork that we'll then eat? I have nothing against beef, chicken or pork, by the way. My friend Leif cooked me a great traditional American beef burger last night. Not from the Amazon. But to trade the greatest tropical rainforest in the world for beef and soy today is, I argue, irrational. Especially when we know, due to scientific studies, that the soil in most of the Amazon, although wonderfully rich to sustain the forest and its amazing biodiversity, is rather poor to enable productive large-scale agriculture and cattle farming. So after a few decades of low productivity use, the land claimed from the Amazon forest is often degraded and needs to be abandoned, fueling a vicious cycle of ever more deforestation to achieve the same productivity. The trade-off thus is extremely negative, even irrational, I would argue. Perhaps it cannot even be described as a trade-off. What are we gaining? We are killing the most important tropical forests of the world for the sake of burgers and grains that can be easily produced elsewhere at much lower environmental costs. So the only reasonable policy for the Amazon, in my view, and in the view of many climate scientists and environmental scientists, is zero deforestation. As the Brazilian president, new president Lula, actually promised in the Glasgow COP26 in 2021. No distinction between legal and illegal deforestation makes sense in the Amazon biome anymore today, in this day and age. We actually need to reforest the degraded parts of the Amazon that have been abandoned by cattle and soy farms. And this is a great opportunity. There is a lot of degraded land there that can be brought back to secondary forests that then will grow and help with the climate and environmental crisis and make the Amazon more resilient to climate change. But how do we get to zero deforestation? How to stop both illegal and legal deforestation that still takes place in the Amazon at a lower but still alarming rates of 50 times the size of Paris per year. Now, the most stable long-term solution, in my view, would be a drastic cultural change, a fundamental change of mentality. As we have seen earlier, the idea that progress and development involve replacing the forest by short-term economic gain via cattle and grain is ingrained, no pun intended, in the mindset of the Brazilian population. We need to change that. Once a critical mass is achieved of people who understand in line with the science that the trade-off is rather bad for us, disastrous really in the not so long term, then social pressure might help change the behavior of the destroyers of the forest, and new preservationist social norms might develop, and protecting the forest rather than destroying it may become the obvious thing to do for most people. So a cultural change of the sort that turned the tide, for instance, about the morality of slavery in the past. This is the kind of change we need. But the problem, as I can imagine some of you may be thinking right now, is that we don't have much time to wait for this cultural revolution to take place. We need to act sooner. And I agree. We need a much quicker solution. And this is where the law must kick in. Not as a panacea. I'm a social legal scholar, so don't interpret anything I'm saying here today as if lawyers can save the world. I don't think that's the case, but I think law can help. This is the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, which is regarded as one of the most progressive constitutions in terms of environmental protection in the world, and one of the first to recognize a right to an ecologically balanced environment as a human right. And it's also a great victory for the indigenous peoples who managed to include in the Constitution a right to their ancestral lands where they were before they started being expelled by the Portuguese and then by the farmers and now by the miners. So, as the most attentive in the audience will have noticed, in this graph, sorry to go back, I should have repeated the slide. There was a period there of a drastic reduction of deforestation from the mid-2000s when we got to levels which were then acceptable, 4.5 thousand square kilometers, so 45 times the size of Paris, which we cannot afford anymore now, but you can see that something worked here, right? For a period, rather than all this deforestation we had, that the trend was the other way. That was not a miracle, but rather a well-conceived, well-implemented, and well-enforced public policy led by the then Minister of the Environment, Marina Silva, who is a woman born and raised in the Amazon and one of the leading environmentalists in Brazil. Her plan, enacted in 2004, had a long name: Action Plan for the Prevention and Control of Deforestation in the Legal Amazon, or the PPCDAM for short. Some of its measures were rather obvious. For instance, the strengthening of environmental enforcement agencies, something which Bolsonaro very quickly dismantled in his mandate with also obvious effects, negative ones, spikes in deforestation. So the graph here shows a clear correlation between the amount of penalty notices issued by the main environmental agency in Brazil, IBAMA, and levels of deforestation. I don't think that would surprise anyone, but other measures in the PPCDAM were more innovative. The most effective one was the implementation of, till then, largely dormant laws of protected environmental areas and indigenous lands. So in 2000, the Brazilian Congress, I can't see it happening in the Brazilian Congress today in 2024, but back then, they enacted, it was a government initiative that passed Congress, the framework law for the protection of the environment, creating the SNUC, National System of Conservation Units, which established the criteria for the demarcation of areas of special environmental interest that would be protected by a new federal environmental agency, the ICMBio. The law had been enforced for almost 4 years, from 2000, but it was in the period of the PPCDAM, led by Marina Silva, that most national and state parks were created. And that turned the forest inside those units formally protected by law, and also sent a signal to land grabbers and land invaders that the state was present and willing to sanction lawbreakers. Alongside the creation of these conservation units, a strong policy of demarcation of protected territories for indigenous groups took place. So millions of hectares of indigenous lands were demarcated. And that again, not only formally protected them and sent signals to wrongdoers as well. So this vast network of legally protected land made clear where the boundaries for economic exploitation of the forest were and helped to preserve it. Studies show now that most deforestation happens inside private land or land whose property title is not clear. Inside conservation units, especially indigenous lands, you have the lowest levels of deforestation in the Amazon. So with a dose of political will and the help of technology, the PPCDEM also used a lot of satellite monitoring systems that became more and more effective. Deforestation came down to unprecedented low levels. So as a piece in the NASA Earth Observatory well puts it, and I quote, "It was ambitious and it worked. Within a few years, large-scale deforestation dropped by roughly 50%. By 2012, forest clearing was down nearly 80%, or roughly 5,000 square kilometers per year. The turnaround was heralded as one of the world's most dramatic environmental success stories." So we know what to do. We have the tools. And as many of you know, the current government is made of the same people that were in power when the PPCDEM was implemented. So Lula is again the president, and Marina Silva is once more Minister for the Environment. A new PPCDEM is now in place, and deforestation has lowered, but as I claimed, again, it's still way too high. We need to do more. Now, it would require another lecture for us to discuss the adequacy and efficiency of the current government in the environmental sphere, especially within what is perhaps the most challenging political environment in Brazil's democratic history, with the Congress of 2022, dominated by representatives of the agribusiness interests, so people who want exactly the opposite to what I am arguing should be done here now. There are actually lots of bills in Parliament trying to dismantle all the legal framework that I believe should be enforced to save the Amazon. So in the short time I have left, I won't go into that thorny debate. We can discuss a bit of that in the Q&A if you want, but I would like to focus on one potential additional avenue that I think may help in the goal of diminishing deforestation more speedily and radically. So as it is evident, the drivers, the actual drivers of deforestation are not the cattle, the soil, the wood, or the minerals that I mentioned earlier. Without an avid market where these goods can be commercialized for a profit, they will not be produced in the first place, and the forest would still be there, standing. So if we are to address deforestation in the Amazon effectively, I think we must focus not only on punishing and fining the direct forest destroyers, the farmers, loggers, and miners, which is what the PPCDEM does well, if well implemented. We must also disincentivize and also penalize, when appropriate, all participants in the production and consumption chain of these commodities. So we must find a way of making it clear to the consumers of burgers, like me and Leif, and maybe a few other people in the room, that their meat is produced when it comes from the Amazon at the cost of destroying biodiversity, worsening climate change, and often violating traditional people's human rights, who are expelled from their land to give way to cattle and soil. And we must do the same, disincentivize and penalize, with the funders of such destructive activities. Behind the farmers, small and big, who produce the harmful commodities, there are banks, investment funds, pension funds, who provide the capital for the companies who buy and process these commodities and sell them onto the consumer markets, often located outside Brazil, here in the US, in Europe, in China, etc. There are also the shipping companies involved in the transportation of these goods. They should also be part of the solution. So if we are to have a chance of stopping the destruction, we need to somehow implicate morally and legally, like we did with slavery, the whole network of production and consumption of the commodities of destruction. I hope Leif will help me find a better name for that, like his blood oil book. Blood commodities, I don't know. It doesn't work because we are destroying the green environment. So to do that effectively, we need the following: a reliable tracing system that identifies with accuracy the origin of beef, soy, wood, and minerals, and their route through the supply chain until their final sale to consumers. And that system would enable a duty on sellers to identify the origin of the product clearly in the label of the product for the consumer to decide consciously whether to buy it or not. And a warning in the label of products from high-risk areas that the product might be implicated in environmental harm and human rights violations. Something similar to what we achieved with tobacco, for instance. So you didn't make it illegal, but you have a big picture in the front, in the label of the product saying it can cause cancer. Something of the sort. And second, the stronger laws of accountability of actors in the whole of the supply chain who profit from the commodities of destruction, including buyers, processors, importers, shipping companies, financiers. And that should be can be divided in three main areas: a duty of diligence to find out where your commodities are coming from, civil liability, compensation for the harm caused, and also criminal liability. There are some laws in place in Europe outlawing proceeds of crime to come into the European market, and the commodities that are produced in indigenous land in the Amazon or illegally deforested land are proceeds of crime, because in Brazilian law, environmental destruction is a crime. So the good news, and I'm finishing, is that just as developments in science are making the importance of protecting the Amazon increasingly clearer, developing technology and information sharing are also making the traceability of products more feasible, and developments in law are making the accountability of the actors in the supply chain stronger. So we still have a long way to go and not much time left, but I think we are moving in the right direction. So as I don't have much time left either, I want to finish by an interesting example of how this might work, like a more concrete example. So I have mentioned Paris several times in this talk to make more concrete the magnitude of Amazon deforestation. So even with the reductions we have, we are still losing 50 Paris of forest every year in the Brazilian Amazon. Now, a large chunk of this deforestation, as I also mentioned, is to give way to cattle farming to produce beef. The largest beef trader in the world is a Brazilian company. Does anyone know which company that is? The JBS, which was actually has grown a lot during the Lula years in government as well. So there is like complex connections between the current government and the destruction of the Amazon as well, that we can discuss later if you want. But JBS buys cattle from all over Brazil, and he slaughters them in one of its several slaughterhouses, also spread across the country, packages and sells the beef through one of its several brands that you wouldn't recognize in the supermarkets, but we know what they are through investigation. And due to the excellent investigations by journalists and civil society organizations, including Repórter Brasil and Mighty Earth, to name just a couple, we know that at least some of the meat sold by JBS to a Brazilian supermarket, to two Brazilian supermarket chains called Carrefour and Pão de Açúcar, Sugar Loaf, as in the famous Rio de Janeiro mountain, came from illegally deforested land, included a farm that invaded an indigenous land protected by law. So this investigation managed to establish that some of the meats sold by JBS to the supermarkets Carrefour and Pão de Açúcar are illegally sourced through environmental harm and human rights violations. Now, this was only possible due to a new tracing methodology put together by a group of civil society organizations that some of you might know, including TRACE, the Stockholm Environmental Institute, University College Louvain, and Reporter Brazil, which is a news platform in Brazil, that led to an app called Do Pasto ao Prato in Portuguese, from the farm to the plate. So with that app, the consumer of beef in Brazil can scan the product and get information about its origin, and then decide whether to buy it or not. So it's not in the label yet, but you can scan it. But we should go further and not just put the liability on the consumer to decide or not to decide to buy the meat. We should hold the supermarket and all its financial enablers accountable for selling deforestation beef. As I said earlier, we need stronger laws of accountability, and these are developing across the world. So these are the other piece of good news. We have the EU directive coming into force soon. We have the UK Environment Act 2021. And in France, one of the early comers in that field, we have the devoir de vigilance, the duty of diligence that imposes on companies a duty to investigate and know where their products are coming from. So it was based on this later law that very creative French lawyers from Seattle advocates, in cooperation with several civil society organizations in Brazil, including the ones I mentioned already that did that app, filed a lawsuit in the French courts against the company Casino. So what's the connection between Casino and deforestation in Brazil? Casino has not, so far as it's known, directly sold any deforestation beef from the Amazon here in Europe. But it owns the supermarket chains Carrefour and Pão de Açúcar in Brazil, who, according to that investigation, have sourced meat from deforested and invaded land. So the argument is that Casino has breached its duty of vigilance by allowing deforestation beef to be sold in its supermarkets in Brazil, and should thus be liable and pay compensation for the damage that it has caused. So the case is pending in the courts in France, and hopefully we will have a positive result. So to finish, this is just one example of how we could move forward and strengthen corporate accountability to help save the Amazon. There are hundreds of companies profiting from the destruction of the forest, and millions of consumers inadvertently aiding them. We can and should reverse this harmful trend, in my view. We have the science, we have the laws. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Octavio. Would you take some questions from the audience?
Yes, of course.
Fantastic. We have a full house, so please make your voices heard. And maybe can we group questions and have 3 at a time, something like that? Okay. So then, Estefania, Joao.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is devastating information, but at the same time, you know, I have hope for the future and what we can do. And I guess that's also part of my question. What can we do as non-Brazilian citizens or voters from the outside? And also, just wanted to question if consumers of the beef that's being produced in the Amazon is only localized within Brazil, or if it's also localized within adjacent countries.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk, for a fantastic talk. I'd like to comment a little on current events and see if it's possible to associate with what you presented. We've been hearing a lot about the legalization of false land titles as a method of deforestation and occupying public lands in Brazil, grilagem. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that problem and what solutions are there.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm actually from Manaus, so
Okay.
this talk is particularly interesting to me. And I had a question about also the role of the state government in protecting the forest. I'm wondering, like, what is the jurisdiction and legislation about what can be done in terms of deforestation, not only laws, but actual implementation of projects. Is this done only by the federal government? Does the state government plays a role? And I was particularly interested in the big fall that there is during the PT government. Do we see trends like that of like big changes also with state governments in like the most important states in terms of where the Amazon is, or is this more related to the federal government?
Thank you.
That's fun.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. So, what can we do as foreigners? I'm a foreigner of sorts as well because I live in England, in the UK. And I think we can do a lot. So it would be a long list, but I'll focus on a couple of things that I think would help significantly those fighting on the ground there. And that's what I hear from them as well when I visit these places. Please help us. So not consuming the products that come from there is like one first obvious thing, but it's difficult because you don't know. So that's why we have to develop this traceability methodologies even further. This app I mentioned only works in Brazil. So it doesn't, I've tried to download it today to maybe demonstrate to you, but it said we are not available in your country yet. So I think that kind of technology would help immensely consumers who are conscious to stop buying these destruction commodities until I find a better name with the help of Leif. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. I try to always read like the labels of the products to see. Sometimes it says from Brazil, but where in Brazil? There is legitimate cattle being produced in Brazil and illegitimate in the Amazon. So we have to improve that, and I think we are moving in that direction. I think in the not distant future we'll probably be able to know exactly where the products are coming from. So that's why I put more faith in the accountability side of companies, because they know where their product is coming from or should know. And that's exactly what the French law says. The devoir de vigilance is you cannot bring into Europe products that you know or should have known come from these places. And then the should have known opens a huge space of legal interpretation and fights in the courts. I expect this case against Casino to last a long time, but it will be important in terms of establishing the threshold of burden, the threshold of burden for the company to prove that they knew or didn't know where the product comes from. There is evolving technology that can be put on cows, like chips, to trace their movements as well, that you can oblige the company to do that at not much cost. So for some, I don't know your background or whether you are a lawyer or not. No? Yeah. So support these kinds of initiatives, make it more, spread the knowledge that some people don't know about what is happening there. So we have lots of new platforms that are trying to do that. Monga Bay, Suma Uma, Repórter Brasil with pieces in English showing all these connections. we have a series in the Transnational Law Institute together with Summa Uma called Unsustainable, of the companies that are at the heart of the Amazon sourcing the products that end up here. And as lawyers, we are trying to strengthen this legislation so that these companies have to report more in more detail where they are bringing the products from and publish that so that everyone can know. But like you, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic that we are moving in the right direction. Well, that's a huge topic, the legalization of false titles. So one of the biggest problems in the Amazon is that vast amount of land, 5.5 million square kilometers, was once like those indigenous lands, right? No, there weren't titles to any of the land there. And then when Brazil started to develop, they created titling systems that are very, still to this day, but even more so then, imperfect. People would go there and claim a piece of land and then have like a piece of paper, a document, take it to the Ministry of Agriculture and the agency INCRA and get some formal document that the land was theirs. But the state of Pará, which is the second largest in the Amazon and where most of deforestation is taking place at the moment, has, if you took into account all the people who claim to own land in Pará, Pará would have to have 4 floors. Yeah, and so and this is a funny joke, but also very tragic, because the conflict of land in Pará often ends up with violence and people being killed. There was the awful case of Dorothy Stang, the American missionary who was assassinated there, trying to defend the lands of the indigenous people. So it's a big problem. But again, with new technology, it will be easier and easier to georeference the areas and demarcate them and check the titles and clean like this huge mess that it is at the moment, and especially with the creation of conservation units that happened a lot in the Amazon and could spread more under a more favorable government. I think you can clearly indicate where that land belongs to the federal government. I'm starting already answering your question, and is being used by indigenous communities, riverine communities, quilombola communities. So the Constitution doesn't give title to these groups. It gives them the right to use that land, which is still federal land, forever. But what happens is that private people come, invade it, claim it's theirs, and you need enforcement agencies to come and try and solve that difficult situation, which is related to the third question, is the role of state governments. So we rely a lot on federal governments for this and human rights situations, because local governments tend to be more aligned with local groups that benefit from those situations. So a top-down interference by federal government is often necessary. So I'll give you, and also because of resources. The federal government is much more resourceful than the state governments or municipal governments to go in and get people out of indigenous lands, protect the conservation units. So this new federal agency, MPhil, was created to police the federal conservation units, in part because they knew that state governments and municipal governments will not do it, either because they don't want to do it, which is the case of many states in the north, which are controlled by the right wing, who doesn't want to protect the Amazon, but also because even those who want cannot do it. One recent example of this disparity of resources is the floods in Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state in Brazil. The federal government has to interfere because the state itself cannot help. So, but of course, it would help to have some local politicians aligned with that mentality of protecting the Amazon. Next year, we'll have COP in Pará, and the governor of Pará, Elder Barbalho, wants to be this green guy who will show the world how you can preserve the Amazon with sustainable development projects. So many people are skeptical about how genuine he is in his talks, and that the local powerful interest there of mining in particular. Pará has a lot of gold. It's one of the largest gold repositories in the world, right in the middle of the Munduruku indigenous people's land. So that picture I showed you was in the Munduruku area, where illegal miners are invading and mining. But there could be a project, if Parliament passes a law allowing mining indigenous land, saying we are going to clear this area of indigenous peoples and exploit the gold which is sitting there. And for those things, that the local governments would be important to help the federal government, but it's not a given. It depends on who the population elects, and in the elections, in the last elections, it might sound contradictory, but the North was very much Bolsonarista, and there were a few places only where Lula won. If not for the Northeast, Bolsonaro would probably have won the election. So you can see how the local politics in the North has been dominated by people who are not in favor of what I'm suggesting today, to put it mildly.
So we have time maybe for a couple more questions, and we can also stick around, but at one point we're going to stop recording, right? So that moment is coming soon, and there's going to be an announcement, but anyways, who has the next round of questions? Fantastic. So Alberto, 1, 2, and 1/3 question. That's going to be the end? Yes. Yes.
So, thank you so much for this. It was extremely interesting. So I want to follow up a little bit on the question about local governments and state governments. So, Monge Bay and also there's a recent paper in Nature or Science on the ghost roads in Southeast Asia. So this is kind of a local challenge. You know, the roads are there, opened up, and the mayor knows that they've been opened. You know, you can do it with satellite, but in a way, there's like all these webs of complicity going on in the local politics. And the thing about this paper, for example, is just this finding that the roads really predict the deforestation. If you could just stop the roads, these illegal roads, these ghost roads. So I wanted to ask you, you know, about, because kind of, in a way you said we have the law and we have the science, but we don't have the politics.
As I'm sure most people here know, biofuels are very important in Brazil, particularly sugar-based ethanol. In fact, most of the passenger vehicle fleet actually has flex fuel engines, so they can either use gasoline or sugar-based ethanol. But one of the things you hear in the United States also is an accusation that this industry contributes to deforestation in the Amazon. I wonder if you can comment whether that is true or not.
And then, so I had a question too about the picture you paint. It's very elegant, the coincidence of science and legal tools that are possible to use. But I wonder, like, who would lose if what you propose were to take effect? Like, what, in another way of asking that is, what is the source of real opposition or the locus of opposition that must be so politically meaningful that it's able to stave off some of these things? Like, who's at stake? And then the second question, like, is there a sacrifice that people are going to have to make to protect the Amazon, even if it's in their rational self-interest, a long-term interest. But it sounds like it might be more than just, well, I'll just avoid this brand of beef and make sure I get this brand of beef, like, but I'm still getting a burger. Like, is there something that's required of us maybe that's more morally demanding than that?
Great questions. So yes, we have the science, we have the laws, we don't have the politics. In the past, government that was clearer than ever that what can the law and the science do when you have someone at the head of the government telling people go and mine in indigenous lands, pledging famously that I'm not gonna protect any more land, 1 inch of land in the Amazon during my mandate as president, and he managed to do this, right? Because it's so easy to do it. You just have to sit there and do nothing, right? And these political signals are sometimes more important than any laws there. So we saw an explosion of invasion of land, and the people are saying nothing is going to happen to us. The environmental agencies were gutted. They put at the head of the indigenous agency a military person who was clearly against the demarcation of indigenous lands. The minister for the environment was a convicted logger. So without the political will, we don't go anywhere. But my source of optimism is that will change. That with time, people will realize that this is bad for them. And part of the agribusiness groups in Brazil have already realized that and lined up with Lula and Marina Silva in the previous elections rather than with Bolsonaro. But it's not easy. It's hard. I mentioned earlier that one of the first measures of Lula when he came to power was to send the federal police and the army into the Yanomami land to kick out the illegal miners that were there. After a year, many were back. You cannot keep, it's vast. So the level of resources needed. So that's why, without a change of mentality that turns that into something that the people themselves, local people, complain about, and there are some signs that in some municipalities there has been this change of mentality, even from the generation that occupied the Amazon in the 50s and 60s, and their grandchildren, who are now want to still produce beef and soy, but without encroaching on the forest with new technologies. So I think there is some hope there that with the mentality, politics will change as well. I think that links with part of the third question, that what is the source of real opposition to that, right? I think it's the short-term profit motivation of a few people, and that's why it's not that difficult. With the political will in the federal government, you saw the graph, how deforestation went down significantly. Sometimes even putting like just a sign. I visited one of these conservation units there, who fought for years and years for the federal government to send a basic sign. We could do it here, like in Palo Alto, in some shop, like in 5 minutes, saying this is federally protected land. You cannot come here and fish, log, etc. Like at the entrance of the river where the land starts. And just something like that can have an effect on people. Okay, the state is here. I cannot do whatever I want. But when the opposite happens, like in the Bolsonaro years, and said, don't worry, like you're not going to be fined. So I think this can change quite dramatically because the interests are not that big there. It's like very locally powerful economic interests, but in the scale of Brazil and what the government could put there to stop it, and the importance of the Amazon, it's not unthinkable that we could counter those interests. Biofuels, sugar-based ethanol. There is sugarcane in the Amazon, but not to the scale there is soy. I'm not sure whether soy can also be used as biofuel.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah. So probably some of the soy ends up in that, but from our research so far, most of the soy in the Amazon ends up as food for pork and chicken to then become burgers, like to be sold in supermarkets. But there is some sugar cane, and if some of the soy is used in biofuels, there must be some effect. But according to the latest research, beef is 80%, and then soy and corn 15%, mining 1% of deforestation, and logging, which used to be huge, but now there's so little left of the good wood that it's gone down a lot, and there are lots of reforestation farms in the south and southeast of Brazil that supply the paper that we use, so it doesn't come from the Amazon anymore. So beef is the main culprit, and that's why some lawyers are trying to bring a case against JBS. In the US, there is a case that General Attorney of New York has filed a complaint against JBS because of greenwashing its information when they want to do an IPO and open there, and we'll see where that goes. Sacrifice. I used to think that we would need to stop eating beef in general to save the planet. I don't think, I've seen more studies more recently that it is possible to keep like eating, but at much lower levels than we do. And that would be compatible with reducing CO2 emissions, climate change, etc. But we do that certainly sacrifice in our lifestyles is needed for the broader challenge of fighting climate change. Right? The level of waste that we create with our lifestyles, consumerist lifestyles, is incompatible with decreasing the CO2 emissions at the level we need. But more specifically in the Amazon, where I know more, I think there is enough production capacity in Brazil outside the Amazon to supply the beef that people want to eat, still want to eat. I remember when Lula came to power in his first time, and now as well, he said, my dream is that everyone in Brazil can eat picanha. Picanha is a specific cut, the cap of the rump that Brazilians love, right? And I think it will be hard to change culturally that, but you can change the mindset to say, I don't want beef from the Amazon because I know what is happening there. So that kind of sacrifice is not that great, right? Like just knowing where you buy your beef from is, I think it's feasible. But I think that to leave it just to consumers is not fair, and it's not going to do the job. I think we need to reinforce the accountability of the traders, the shippers, and I think we are managing to legally get there. You say it's an elegant coincidence I agree. It's elegant. We need to work more and more on that.
Let me do some closing remarks because it is time. But first, let us thank Professor Ferraz for the token of appreciation. Some Center for Latin American Studies swag. I had an inkling that this talk would be a very welcome closure to our year of activities, and I'd like to share for a couple of minutes why before we really do closing announcement. So this talk, of course, mobilized the law and technology. It opens other questions, right? Who is going to wield the technology? Who is the we? I was reminded of a moment in the war drugs in Colombia in the 90s when the discovery occurred that the cartels had their own submarines, which they were making out of fiberglass. So it is not guaranteed who is going to hold the technology or make the law, for that matter. That is not guaranteed, and I think that's something that Alberto Diaz-Calleros' question about who is the political agents here are made clear. So I point this to note how multidisciplinary problems are and how big they are. There's dimensions that your amazing talk allow us to think. And the Center for Latin American Studies as a hub for interdisciplinary research is a good place to do that. But let me add to the disciplines involved in this conversation. Philosophy, the question about what is valuable in itself and what is instrumentally valuable of the jungle is an open question. It's a huge question. We need to revisit that, and philosophers are well equipped to think that through. Theology, no less. Why? Because we use the term sacrifice. We could have used the term compromise, but we use the term sacrifice, which is to make something sacred. We need to revisit and think about that theologically. Of course, literature aesthetics, which is the domain I happen to work on, you cannot overcome plant blindness unless you learn to see differently, which engages your senses and your aesthetic experience of the world. For an example, if you haven't all watched it, I highly recommend, I just checked, it is available on YouTube, the 1989 documentary by Jorge Furtado, Ilha das Flores, Isle of Flowers. That is an intervention into the sensoria that makes visible the supply chain. 1989, Ilha das Flores. So aesthetics is in a continuum as it happens with finance, because it sure happens that, as you showed, there are flows here of capital that might inform, say, our retirement funds. Okay, our pensions might be connected to this. So imagine, we also need to have in this room people who can parse out the finances. And of course, scale. You did such a wonderful job at conveying that. So we need people with quantitative skills. For those of you in the MA program that were, banging your heads against all the quantitative work that you had to do with several of us in this room, or of you in this room, I should say, it pays off, right? It pays off to know scale, to know numbers, to be able to convey them, to visualize them, to do justice to the object of study. To summarize then, we had STS and in Science, Technology and Society Studies, philosophy, theology, aesthetics, finance, statistics, and I haven't even talked about the notion of a moral revolution in Appia, but that is for after talk conversation. So I just wanted to summarize that to get this conversation to continue multidisciplinarily into the new year. Unfortunately, our current MA cohort will not be with us, and we're going to miss you, but we're also going to celebrate you very soon at a lovely commencement party here in the patio, and our guests, not really guests, but in-house speaker for that day will be Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I don't know if that has been announced yet, but he will be doing the commencement address, and thank you very much, Alberto, for doing that. It is really appreciated. As the year comes to a close, we will also have tonight at 6 p.m. a party
here in Bolivar House. It is the Spring Fiesta, as it's known, and it's a Quechua night edition. It is organized by the folks involved here with Quechua language instruction. We also have, on the subject of announcements, and let me pass the mic over to Leif, the Brazil Day. Leif, could you tell us about that, please?
Brazil Day is Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. It starts at 3:30 with a panel. Issues in Brazil, what are the challenges, what are the hopes for progress? There'll be some Brazilian catering after the panel where everyone can get together and have some fantastic food. And then Octavio has produced a very powerful film on police violence in Rio afterwards. So please come for any or all of Brazil Day. It'll be at the Humanities Center starting at 3:30 on Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, am I forgetting anything? Okay, so let me also use this opportunity to thank you all for your participation.